What if everything you knew about St. Petersburg was a lie? Imagine a majestic city on the Neva, the pearl of Russia, the northern capital. Textbooks tell us a simple story. Peter I founded it in 1703 on an empty swamp. One man, one will, one decision, and a city arose from nothing. But what if, beneath this beautiful legend, lies something greater? What if St. Petersburg remembers other masters, other eras, other civilizations? Look at 18th century maps. Strange, isn't it? A city supposedly just built looks as though it had existed for centuries. Sophisticated planning, well-designed streets, a canal system impossible to create in just a few years. And around it, forgotten fortresses, silently standing where they shouldn't be. Koporya, Ivangorod, Narva, Yam. These names mean nothing to most people, but these fortresses guard a secret no one wants to notice. Official history is simple and convenient. Peter saw the strategic importance of the location. Peter decided to build a fleet. Peter erected a city among the swamps, defying nature and common sense. Hero, reformer, creator. Simple stories are always suspicious. Simple stories hide complex truths. Let's look at the map more carefully. Those very ancient fortresses, Koporya, Ivangorod, Narva, Yam, are positioned strangely, very strangely. Officially, they're called maritime fortresses that protected the coast. But here's the problem. They stand far from the water. Kilometers and kilometers of land separate them from the Gulf of Finland. Why build maritime fortresses deep inland? Perhaps the sea was closer. Perhaps waves once lapped at their walls. Perhaps what we consider land was once the bed of an ancient bay. There exists such a concept, the Baltic-Ladoga Klint, a geological escarpment stretching across the entire region. Scientists say this is an ancient coastline, the boundary between sea and land that existed tens of thousands of years ago. And all these fortresses, every single one, are built along this Klint. Coincidence? The official version explains this through strategic considerations. The fortresses controlled river routes and overland roads. Logical. Convenient. But then, why have the rivers where they stand turned into pitiful streams today? Rediona, Kopa, Luga, Nava, Volkhov. Medieval chronicles describe them as wide waterways along which trading ships sailed. Merchants transported goods from Novgorod to Europe. Varangians descended these waters to the sea. Entire flotillas plied these rivers. And today? Today, Kopa is so shallow you can ford it. Luga has grown shallow beyond recognition. Even the mighty Narva has turned into a narrow stream. What happened to the water? Where did the rivers go? Perhaps sea level changed. Perhaps a catastrophe altered the landscape. Perhaps these fortresses once truly stood at the water's edge, controlling the maritime gateway to an ancient civilization. Now let's return to St. Petersburg. Official history tells of heroic construction of a city on a swamp. Thousands of workers perished, driving piles into boggy ground. Hunger, disease, inhuman conditions. But the Tsar was adamant. The city must stand here. Why here? Nearby were highlands, dry, solid hills where construction would have been 100 times easier. Riverbanks where endless piles wouldn't have been needed. But no. Peter chose the most inconvenient, most desolate place. Think about the logistics. Where in the early 18th century, during the Great Northern War, did resources come from for such a colossal project? Russia was at war with Sweden. The treasury was depleted. The army demanded supplies. The people were starving. And at this moment, the Tsar decides to build an enormous city from scratch. Where did materials come from? How were they delivered? Who planned the streets with such mathematical precision? Where did architects capable of creating perfect layouts come from? How were hundreds of buildings erected in just a few years? Look at old maps of St. Petersburg. Maps from the 1710s, the 1720s. They show a city that looks as though it had always existed. A sophisticated canal system, well-designed squares, districts that arose as if by magic. Too fast, too perfect, too ready. What if Peter didn't build the city from scratch? What if he was restoring it? What if beneath the swamps of St. Petersburg lay ruins of an ancient civilization? What if sea level changed, flooding entire settlements, and then the water receded, exposing forgotten foundations? Perhaps Peter wasn't a pioneer. Perhaps he was an archaeologist who excavated a city built long before Rus, a city that remembered other languages, other laws, other stars in the sky. Folk legends of Ingermanland, as this land was called before Peter, are filled with stories of cities that went underwater, of great floods that wiped entire civilizations from the face of the earth, of phantom ships appearing on foggy nights at the sites of ancient harbors. Old people spoke of stone walls that sometimes emerge from beneath the ground after heavy rains, of underground passages leading who knows where, of strange symbols on foundation stones that resemble neither Scandinavian runes nor Slavic script. These stories were ridiculed as superstitions. But what if every legend contains a grain of truth? Imagine an ancient world. 10,000 years ago, 15,000, 20,000. The Baltic Sea looked completely different. Water levels were different. Climate was milder or harsher. And on these lands lived people whose civilization left no written records. Or did it, but we don't know how to read them. The Klint was their boundary, the edge of the world, the place where land met the infinite ocean. They built fortresses along this line. They traded, they fought. They created art and technologies we can only guess at. And then something happened. Catastrophe. Flood. Climate change. The sea flooded their cities. Water erased traces of their culture from the face of the earth. The civilization disappeared, leaving only stone skeletons of fortresses and vague legends. Millennia later, the water receded. Swamps dried up. The land became habitable again. And Peter, perhaps, accidentally stumbled upon these ruins. He saw potential. He saw ready-made planning. He saw foundations that could be used. Why build from scratch when you can restore what already exists? Perhaps the entire story of heroic construction on empty ground is a legend covering a more complex truth. Perhaps Peter didn't want to acknowledge that his new capital was actually very, very old. Why? What was in this city that required secrecy? What secrets do its foundations hold? What knowledge was buried along with the ancient civilization? And most importantly, who were the true builders of St. Petersburg? We're used to believing simple explanations. Textbooks give us ready answers. But history is never simple. Behind every official version lie layers of contradictions, oddities, inexplicable details. Fortresses standing far from the sea. Rivers turned into streams. A city that arose too quickly in too unsuitable a place. Ancient maps with incomprehensible symbols. Legends of submerged settlements. All these are puzzle pieces, and if you put them together, the picture is completely different from what we were told. St. Petersburg is a city of mysteries. A city that perhaps preserves memory of a civilization that existed long before us. A city whose true origin is hidden beneath layers of official history. What if Peter I didn't found St. Petersburg? What if he simply uncovered what had been buried for centuries? And the main question every thinking person should ask, if this is true, how many more such cities lie hidden beneath our feet? How many civilizations were erased from the face of the earth? and forgotten. Perhaps we live on the ruins of worlds we know nothing about. Perhaps our history doesn't begin with the first written sources, but much, much earlier. And St. Petersburg is only the beginning of this story. Now, let's look at the facts. Not at legends, not at speculation, at what can be seen with your own eyes, touched with your hands, measured with instruments. The Baltic-Ladoga Klint. This isn't just a pretty word from a geography textbook. This is a geological escarpment stretching more than 1,000 kilometers, from Sweden through all the Baltic states to Lake Ladoga. A rocky cliff ranging from 3 to 56 meters in height. Scientists are unanimous. This is an ancient coastline, the boundary between sea and land that existed at the end of the Ice Age. Tens of thousands of years ago, waves washed these cliffs. Here was the edge of the world. Here, the solid ground ended, and the abyss began. And now, the most interesting part. All the ancient fortresses of the region, Kopordia, Ivangorod, Narva, Yam, Rakvere, are built along this line. Every one, without exception. Look at the map. Draw a line along the Klint. Now mark the fortresses. They follow the curves of the escarpment with astonishing precision, as if someone deliberately placed them along the ancient shoreline. Why? What did the builders of these fortresses know? Why did they choose this exact line? The official version speaks of strategic control over river routes. Logical. But river routes can be controlled from anywhere. Yet these fortresses stand precisely on the Klint, precisely on the ancient seashore that no longer exists. Perhaps the builders remembered. Perhaps their culture preserved memory of the time when the sea was nearby. Perhaps they built on the sites of more ancient fortifications, erected by those who actually saw water at the foot of the cliffs. Rivers. Let's talk about rivers. Medieval chronicles of the 12th to 13th centuries describe Koper as a full-flowing river, along which Novgorod merchants transported goods to the sea. Rediona is mentioned as an important waterway. Luga was wide enough for navigation. Today, Koper is a stream you can jump over. Rediona has turned into a swampy ditch. Luga has grown so shallow that in summer it dries up in places. What happened to the water? Where did the full-flowing rivers go? Perhaps the climate changed. Perhaps tectonic processes raised the land and the riverbeds grew shallow. Perhaps the groundwater level was once much higher. Or perhaps it's simpler and more frightening. Sea level changed. Sharply. Catastrophically. Imagine. An ancient sea floods the lowlands. Rivers turn into wide estuaries. Cities on the shore go underwater. Then, after centuries or millennia, the water recedes. The sea grows shallow. Rivers lose their strength. And where waves once splashed, swamps emerge. Boggy, impassable swamps. The very swamps on which Saint Petersburg was supposedly built. But beneath these swamps, something greater may be hidden. Archaeologists find amazing things along the Klint. Burial mounds whose age is difficult to determine. Ship burials, a tradition characteristic of Scandinavians, but found here long before the official appearance of Vikings. Byzantine coins from the 10th to 11th centuries. Trade seals from Hanseatic cities. Brass rings of unknown origin. Glass beads from the Mediterranean. Amber artifacts from the Baltic. This is not an isolated swamp. This is a crossroads of civilizations, a hub of trade routes, a place where the cultures of Scandinavia, Rus, Byzantium, and Western Europe met. But official history claims this was a wasteland, wild lands inhabited by sparse Finnish tribes. How to explain the finds? How to explain traces of developed trade? How to explain that this region was connected to the most distant corners of the medieval world? Perhaps history is more complex. Perhaps a civilization existed here about which we know almost nothing. A civilization whose cities were washed away by a great flood. A civilization from which only burials, coins, and vague legends remain. Names. Pay attention to names. Villages and towns around Saint Petersburg bear strange names. Kaporia, from an ancient Germanic root meaning copper. Ivangorod, seemingly a Russian name, but stands on the site of a more ancient settlement with an unknown name. Narva, a Finnish word meaning threshold or waterfall. Yam is a mystery altogether. Officially, it's believed the name comes from a postal station, but archaeologists find here traces of settlements that existed long before postal stations. Local legends are full of stories about ghosts, about strange creatures living near the Klint cliffs, about voices sounding at night from underground, about glowing fogs rising from crevices in the rocks. Superstitions, of course. But why are these legends so similar to myths of other cultures about cities that went underwater? Why do they repeat the same motif? A great civilization was punished for pride and disappeared in the waves. Scandinavian sagas describe the eastern lands as mystical places, boundaries between worlds, places of power. In the sagas, the Klint is mentioned as a sacred frontier beyond which alien lands begin, full of dangers and wonders. Why did Scandinavians consider these places special? What did they know about the Klint? Perhaps their ancestors remembered times when cities of a more ancient civilization stood here. Along the Klint, they find rock sanctuaries, small caves and grottos with signs of cultic use. Rock paintings whose age provokes disputes among scientists. Some date them to several centuries, others speak of millennia. Images of strange creatures, spirals and circles, boats with high prows, solar symbols. This is not Christian, not pagan Slavic, not Scandinavian symbolism. This is something else, something more ancient. Traces of a spiritual culture we haven't studied. Perhaps because we didn't want to acknowledge its existence. Geology presents its mysteries. In the soil along the Klint, they find strange minerals, melted, as if subjected to high temperatures. The official version: lightning strikes, natural fires, volcanic activity in ancient times. But why is the concentration of these melted minerals so high precisely along the ancient shoreline? Why exactly where the fortresses stood? Perhaps there was a cataclysm. Not just gradual sea level change, but catastrophe, sudden, destructive. A wave capable of erasing cities, fire melting stones. Folk legends speak of a great flood, of waves as high as mountains, of the day when the sea swallowed the earth. These stories were passed from generation to generation until they turned into fairy tales. But what if these aren't fairy tales? What if this is memory of a real event? Geologists confirm the level of the Baltic Sea changed many times. There were periods when it was tens of meters higher. There were times when a significant part of modern land was underwater. Perhaps the catastrophe happened quickly. Earthquake, tsunami, breach of an ice dam. And the civilization that existed on these shores was swept away in a matter of hours. Its cities sank. Its people perished. Only those who lived deep inland, far from the coast, remained. And they told their children about great cities that went underwater. Centuries later, the water receded, but the cities remained buried under silt and sand. Swamps covered the place where life once thrived, until Peter came. The modern Klint is a tourist destination. Ivangorod waterfalls, Kaporia caves, panoramic views from the cliffs. People come here to take photos, not knowing they stand on the border of a forgotten world. Botanists find relict plants here, species preserved from the Ice Age. They grow only on the Klint, as if it's the last refuge of ancient flora. Why have these plants survived here specifically? What's special about these cliffs? Perhaps the climate here was always special. Perhaps these places truly were the edge of an ancient sea, where conditions remained unchanged for millennia. Legends of lost monasteries repeat again and again. Old people tell of stone walls that emerge from underground after downpours, of underground passages going deep into the rocks, of bells whose ringing is heard from underground on quiet nights. Treasure hunters for decades try to find golden statues and ancient icons supposedly hidden in Klint caves. Did anyone find anything? Officially, no. But rumors don't die. Modern cities of the region, Narva, Ivangorod, Kingisepp, are built in the same places where ancient fortresses stood. Their streets follow the curves of the terrain. The layout repeats contours laid down centuries ago. Coincidence? Or did architects instinctively sense the correctness of these places? Or do foundations of far more ancient structures hide beneath modern buildings? St. Petersburg also follows this pattern. Its canals repeat the curves of ancient waterways. Its main thoroughfares run along lines that can be traced on Ice Age maps. Nevsky Prospect, the city's main street. It points exactly to the place where the Klint meets the Neva Delta. Coincidence? Or is this a path worn by millennia? A road that existed long before Peter? Think about it. A city, supposedly built from scratch, follows ancient geological lines. Its layout takes into account terrain formed tens of thousands of years ago. Its architecture fits into the landscape so precisely as if it had always been here. Perhaps it has. Perhaps St. Petersburg wasn't built. It was restored, revived, raised from oblivion. This is not absolute truth. This is not a fact that can be proven in a laboratory. This is a version, a hypothesis, a view of history from a different angle. But see for yourself. Connect the dots. Ancient coastline, fortresses built along it, shallow rivers, archaeological finds indicating developed trade, legends of sunken cities, geological anomalies, the strange speed with which St. Petersburg arose. All these are pieces of a mosaic, and if you put them together, you get a picture of a civilization we lost. A civilization that built cities on the shores of an ancient sea. A civilization that perished in catastrophe. A civilization whose ruins were used to build a new capital. History is more complex than we think. It's full of blank spots, contradictions, inexplicable details. And the more carefully we look, the more questions arise. St. Petersburg is a city of mysteries. A city standing on the foundation of a forgotten era. A city whose true history is only beginning to open. Search for yourself. Ask questions. Look at maps. Read chronicles. Listen to legends. And remember, the official version is always simpler than the truth. And truth hides in details, in oddities, in what doesn't fit into textbooks. Perhaps we live among ruins of a great civilization. Perhaps beneath our feet lie hidden cities we know nothing about. Perhaps St. Petersburg is the key to understanding who we were and where we came from. And perhaps it's time to stop believing simple explanations and start seeking the complex truth.